Would you like to
Oh, from here and
come and join us at the front?
try and control.
Oh, why don't we get a chair and sit on it?
I can stand.
You can go home too, that's fine, you see.
No, I can stand.
I can lean on this thing, you see.
Okay. We lean on each other. Well, any questions? Any things that, or even just adding to discussion? Because it's quite a big subject, isn't it?
It's a huge topic, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Just a little question from Dr. David. Some of this actually is like Bart Ehrman or some of these Muslim critics. Usually, what they actually, the way they strike, to the accuracy of New Testament is more to do with the reproduction, because lack of, the original manuscript is actually not available. So they usually come from that sort of area that, okay, because it's been handwritten and reproduced, so it could have been some errors, over centuries or from one copy to another. And from Muslim perspective, they usually compare that with Quran, because the Quran was the way, has been compiled, was during the Ottoman, and they were obviously burned all the other copies, so this is the right copy and we keep this, and they're referring to that copy as the sort of original or whatever, they called it.
Yeah.
But whereas, in New Testament, the formation of New Testament wasn't really on the base of, it was obviously in the 4th century when that canon obviously formed. So what's your view on those critics who were saying that during this reproduction, there could have been some errors passed on, to today's date, given most of the document, most of the pieces of New Testament, of that 5,400 pieces, are after 9th or 10th century, obviously. A very limited number of them actually goes back to 2nd or 3rd or 4th century.
Well, see, that's the importance that I showed you. Can we put up that that table again, please, if you don't mind. See, that's the importance of a table like this. Now, you see, you take Homer and Iliad, okay? 643 copies, time gap 400 years. Now, there's no classical scholar in all the world who would say that just because there's that huge gap, that we couldn't actually believe that this was a reasonable copy of the original. Okay, they would. But down here, look at the New Testament. Here's a time gap of only 100 years between the first, when we surmise they were written, before 70 AD, most likely, at least for most of for the Gospels at least. And the earliest copies that we've got, approximately 200, so probably just around about 100 years after the originals were written, we've got the earliest copies. So the time gap is very small as historic documents go. And so that itself is a sort of a guarantee that the scriptures have not been contaminated with. The other thing, of course, is that, as I said earlier, we've got all of these manuscripts from around about 100 years gap. And when you compare what we've got of these manuscripts with the earliest fragments that are available, there is actually no difference between them. And so there's actually been a very high level of copying going on through that period of time. Now the Quran's a totally different kettle of fish. The Quran is actually not considered to be orthodox in any language except Arabic. So all the translations that we have are not they're not orthodox according to the Arab. You've got to into the Muslim. You've got to actually learn Arabic and then you can read it. Now we've certainly got that option here because we can learn Greek, and some of us have done that, and we can actually read the original Greek. But we also can say that we think that we can make translations and copies, well, translations actually, of course, that can capture at least the essence of those early writings and transmit them for our spiritual value of the church. So I guess those are my thoughts. George, you'd have some thoughts about it too, I guess.
Well, I think the first thing is that some of the parts of the Bible, one in particular, Paul's writings are earlier than the Gospels.
Yeah.
And 1 Corinthians 15, which has got a a short, if you like, almost a liturgy, could go back to within 30 years of the time. And there's a lot of internal things where you can look into the scriptures and see, and these kinds of statements of faith also occur elsewhere. There's several of them. So the actual dating in parts of it is quite early. That's one thing I would say. I had something else and it's gone now.
Well, I just add, while you're thinking about that, I mean, another thing is that the early church fathers, from dating around 120, 130, thereabouts, their quotations from the Gospels are identical to what our quotations are. And as I said earlier, there's so many of those quoted around that even if we lost every manuscript of the New Testament, we could actually probably devise it again from all of those quotations that all of those church fathers used in their preaching. So that again, I think, is a good reason to be confident about their authenticity.
The other thing I can add is most of these archaeological sort of findings been from 50s or 60s onwards. So obviously it's still discovering, it's still trying to find, and I have no doubt that the original manuscript, at some point they're going to discover that. And then that would be a good proof, that shows that today's copy obviously corresponds to the original copy, original manuscript. So that's still yet to be discovered, and presented as a reward.
Muhammad's autobiography was written about 6th century.
Yeah.
So it's quite late.
Yes.
And there are other problems as well. I mean, there are statements in the Surahs, they call them, which are like chapters, where when you compare Jesus with Muhammad, there's no comparison. That's a whole big subject of its own. But certainly, the other thing too is that the idea that the Bible is being added to and so on, the general agreement with some very good scholars is the time is too short for the legends to grow. I think a person called Sherwin White, or somebody who's a very well-known historian, I think he's a historian, I'm not sure, but the general consensus is that they need more time to grow into legends. And so there are some big differences between the Muslim scriptures, Muhammad himself, and Jesus, and that could form a whole new discussion, a new topic.
Right.
Would the early fragments have been written in the same language as the original was thought to be written in, like up to about 350 AD, say?
Yeah. Well, the New Testament would be largely written in Aramaic, and there are fragments in Aramaic, but a lot of them are in Hebrew. So yeah, there is a bit of a difference there. Yeah. Yeah. What was your question?
One criticism I often see there was that Genesis was not the authenticity of the Bible as such, but the Jewish interpretation of their thing. That Genesis was more a Greek book being interpreted and assimilated into the Jewish tradition and canon, and then from there was appropriate, was continued into Christianity. I can't find anything out there about it as such, but I often hear it as an accusation as such, but you never find it.
Right, so what you're saying is that you've heard people say that Genesis was actually a Greek,
yes,
a Greek type book.
or at least from Greece as such.
Yeah. Well, I'd be really surprised if that was the case, because just think about the Greek, the Greek understanding of the gods. The Greeks believed in multiple gods in various hierarchies who all had responsibilities for different things and who fought each other. They did immoral things. They were in many cases worse than the humans that they were supposed to be governing. And Genesis is not a book like that at all. I mean, Genesis tells us about a loving God who creates, and everything is good. And he creates man, then woman, and everything is good until they go astray. And that's not God's doing, that's somebody else comes in and does that. And so I just think that even just thinking fairly superficially about what the book of Genesis is telling us about God is just so different from anything that the Greeks could possibly even think of. That argument like that, you just throw it out. It's just nonsense. Yeah.
I think it has a bit to do with the so-called mystery religions, which try to say that, like the resurrection is the rising up of something else, and I think that's been well and truly shot down by scholarship, that in fact it's probably the mystery religions borrowed from Christianity.
Yeah.
There's Mithra. Mithraism was a topic that was developed by God, and there's a lot of stuff which is floating around which is not really relevant. It's like the Gospel of Thomas, which has had a lot of debate about, and in those sort of pseudographical, I think they call them, books, they're crazy things that happen. You know, they're not real. And I think the great thing about the Genesis story is it's simple and it's real. Okay, how you interpret is another matter, but the fact that there's one God and that he created everything and he thought it was good. And the word bara, I suppose, is often interpreted as create out of nothing. Whereas you'll find, for example, the Babylonian epics, where you've got a body's divided up and one part forms the heavens and the other forms the earth. I mean, it reeks of mythology, whereas the Genesis story is so simple and very, very clear. How you interpret the date, and that's another matter, but the picture there is one God, and he creates the whole of the universe. There's no comparison. And you'll get people who write, I've read a number of these, I've had to expose myself to them, and they just don't stand up. They just don't stand up to modern scholarship.
Yeah, thanks, George. Yeah, another mystery religion that's poked its head up over the years is called Gnosticism. There are varieties of it, but basically the idea there is that you have to understand some extra special knowledge that only a small group can have if you're really going to come into a relationship with God. And so you've got to, you can accept what the scriptures say, but you've got to have this extra knowledge as well. And that's been a curse in the church over many years. And you'll find that the Gospel of, the epistles of John are actually written largely to refute that sort of thing. And to tell us that our relationship with Jesus Christ is all we need to bring reconciliation between us and God. You don't need any other special knowledge. The secret that Peter talks about and John talks about, the secret is the secret of God's provision of reconciliation for human beings through his Son Jesus Christ. That's an amazing secret. And people still find it hard to believe that. And this is where, again, coming back to the Muslims, the Islamists find it impossible, difficult to believe that God would actually sacrifice himself for people. They can't, they find it very difficult to get around that. When they do get their heads around it though, they really appreciate it and are very often converted by that. Yeah.
Well, if they've only got one God and he kills himself, what happens? It doesn't stack up, does it?
No, that's absolutely right. It doesn't stick out. You're right. Yeah.
If I heard you correctly, you were saying the Old Testament was written over a period of about 3,000 years, something like that. Now, again, from my understanding, it may be incorrect, but sort of writing and so on, really, it started about the time of Moses in Egypt. Now, that was only about, something roughly speaking, 1500 BC or something like that. Now, what sort of writing, what did they write on? And I mean, if you get the Pentateuch, I mean Genesis and so on,
Yeah.
when do you think that was, and Job, which is I reckon to be an old book as well, when do you reckon that was actually first written?
I'm not exactly sure what years they would be, but the original writings, as far as we know, were largely done on papyrus, the reeds that were pounded, just rather like we make paper today, but without the preservatives. But a lot of writing was also done on calf skin, the vellum, and goat skin. Some of it is on clay tablets.
Is that the cuneiform sort of
Yeah,
stuff?
well, it wasn't necessarily
Not
cuneiform. Yeah, it wasn't necessarily cuneiform, but all of the ancient religions, all the ancient empires used clay tablets to some extent for their writing. Yes, I'm not sure that anyone could say with exactitude when writing first began, but I think it began a lot earlier than most people give credit for.
And Moses presumably, possibly have retranslated some of the early writings into Hebrew or whatever.
Yeah.
So, in other words, what we have as the early Hebrew writers would actually be translations of something which was written in some form, in some alphabetical form, maybe 500 years before Moses got at it.
Yeah, well, yes. The other thing to remember is that in ancient times there was a huge tradition of oral history, and the things that they could remember of their family and tribal and national story would just boggle our mind. We just don't. There are some people, some primitive peoples who are still pretty good at it these days, but even the Maori have it to some extent. But those people could pass on their oral stories from hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And so you wouldn't necessarily have to have a written bulk of material at the beginning. It might well have been carried on by oral traditions for many, many years, maybe hundreds of years, before writing appeared and was then taken on that way, perhaps as a kind of insurance in case the oral all disappeared. They put it down in writing.
I mean, I can see the facts of history quite easily be passed on. When you get a book like the Book of Job, it's pretty concentrated stuff.
Yeah.
And for that to be passed on without actually being written in some written form would be a bit more difficult.
Possibly, yeah.
The book of Job was actually from Edom.
Job was
from Edom.
From Edom.
From the area of Edom. It wasn't actually from
Yeah.
It's quoted, I think, in Ezekiel. Somewhere there's a quote that refers to him in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. Job is actually quoted as, I can't remember which era it was, but I mean, there's the picture of Jonah and the resurrection in the New Testament, but there's also, he's referred to somewhere, my memory's not so good these days, but I think it's somewhere in maybe Ezekiel or somewhere like that where he's actually mentioned as a real person. So
Job is.
You might know that too.
I don't know if I can do that.
Because it is quite an amazing book, really. What's in it.
From a counselling point of view, it must be a goldmine.
Well, it certainly looks at the whole question of the relationship of how Satan can be involved in this world, and that good people can suffer.
Yeah.
And Job asked, he asked God, why is this happening to me? And in the end, Job said, well, look, God said, well, look, I'm created this world. Who are you to question me?
Yeah.
Look what I've created. It comes at about chapter 38 after the three friends have had a go at him and saying, look, you must have sinned because you're ill. And God said, no, that's not true. But God didn't answer him. He said, you wouldn't know the answer anyway because it's too complicated.
Yeah.
And then in the end, God blessed him. So, I mean, that's a marvellous, I think, description of what life is like today with suffering. And one of the roles in which we can look at suffering is through how Job went through it.
I also think that there are battles going on at a spiritual level outside of our understanding that we sort of get dragged into from time to time. And I think the book of Job is saying something about that too.
Job is referenced in Ezekiel 14:14.
Sorry?
Job is referenced in Ezekiel 14:14, where God says that even these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it. They were delivered but their own lives for their righteousness.
Okay, so you found it. Good, thanks very much for that.
One
The beauty of having computers, isn't it? Instant answers. Somebody had a question.
Yeah, thanks. It's not related to Job, but it's just another criticism that I've heard from people of my age time and time again, is that a number of books were excluded from the Bible, as you say, upon by church leaders. So how can all books in the Bible be God-breathed? How do we know that for sure? And what is your counterside that books A, B, and C can be good, but the rest can't?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think we sort of covered that a bit earlier in the presentation. There were, particularly if we take, say we take the New Testament books, which are probably a little easier than the Old Testament ones because they do come from a long way away. But in the New Testament, the Gospels, for example, were written by people who must have had some intimate knowledge of Jesus. As I mentioned, Mark is said to have had Peter's input into writing the Gospel of Mark. And as we pointed out, the Gospels were written probably in the time of the lifespan of some people at least who were witnesses of those events. And there's no evidence that anybody complained about the inaccuracy of any of the Gospels. So that's one, I think that's one line of reasoning. It's not as though these books were written thousands of years ago. A lot of people think that's actually something you need to contradict. A lot of people think, when we're talking about New Testament writings, that they were written thousands of years after the event. They're not. They're actually written very close to the event, within living memory. I mean, it's a bit like writing something about World War II in 1975 or 1980. You know. And people are still writing about World War II today. A long time after World War II, and we're not saying that they're not doing the right thing or they're not accurate. People can still write good stuff a long time later, but in the case of the New Testament, we don't have to worry about that because they're written very close to the time when the events occurred. And as George pointed out in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, there's a list that Paul gives of numbers of people who saw Jesus after he was risen, and in one place, and he says that there were 500 people at one time, and then he says most of whom are still alive. So he was writing very early, probably before some of the Gospels, and so he was taking a great risk saying that. If he knew that one of those people was going to say, "Hey, that's not right," but he was able to do it because he was convinced in his own mind that what he was writing was accurate, and that it would be proved to be accurate by the people that he wrote it to or about. Yeah. So I think there's lines of evidence like that you can speak about. Quite apart from the fact that, at least for Christians, it mightn't go down well with non-Christians, but at least for Christians, Jesus said that the Holy Spirit would guide us into all truth. And the church fathers were presumably operating under that mantle just as much as we would hope to be doing today. And so they would be expecting that God would guide them in their discussions about which were the appropriate books and which were not. And so I think that's a third line of evidence that you might perhaps be able to persuade Christian people about, not necessarily non-Christians. Yeah.
Can I just read one thing? The other books, like Epistle to Barnabas, and there's a whole swag of them. They are basically put down to around the end of the 2nd century AD. They're later, and there's things like Syriac influences, and it's a complicated business, but they can look into it and see that this is very much later. And they're given names, they're given fictitious names when they don't actually belong to those people. And the one I suppose had the most support was Gospel of Thomas, and that was involved in the Da Vinci Code or something like that, and that's actually fiction. But you know, I think there's a lot of internal evidence, isn't there, David, that in actual fact they just don't stand up. They've got strange things in them. It's like you mentioned the story, and it's like I think one of them might have been in the, I'm going on memory now, the Epistle of Thomas, where some cross was a talking cross or something which extended up to heaven, and it's got weird things in it. You know, it just doesn't add up. So there's a lot of ways in which you can discredit these other documents.
A question about the relationship between the church people, and the scriptures is a good one. It involves almost like a chicken and egg situation, because the scriptures were birthed by the church and the scriptures support the church. So the interplay between the people of God, the judgments that they make, and the scriptures themselves is sort of a complex web. And I doubt if there's any brave soul who wants to give one precedence over the other.
Yes, that's true. That's an interesting point. Yep, that is an interesting point. Thank you.
David, I've been asked in terms of a particular point of contradiction, or seeming contradiction recently, regarding Jonah spending 3 nights and 3 days in the whale, and Jesus supposedly having spent the same amount of time in the grave, and yet we know that he died on a Friday and was resurrected on the Sunday. How does that compare, and how do we answer somebody who asks that question?
Well, the scripture doesn't anywhere say that Jesus was going to spend 3 nights in the grave. What it says is he was going to be raised on the 3rd day, and he was.
Right.
So I personally, you can say that what happened to Jonah was perhaps a sort of what they call a type of what happened to Christ, but it's not. It's obviously not identical to what happened to Christ.
The other issue is that the Hebrews considered a part of a day as full day. So you've only got a touch on Friday, Saturday and Sunday, and it's 3 days and 3 nights in their understanding at the time. That's how they looked at it.
The phrase "the 3rd day" is kind of like "I'll see you in a minute." It's a kind of traditional phrase, and you can trace it right through the Bible. And in one place, I think it might have been in Esther somewhere, where it speaks about 3 days and 3 nights. So you sometimes get one or the other. So I think it's more of a general phrase, which can be adapted. That's the way I've read anyway. It seems to be not a simple phrase, but it's more a colloquialism.
Thank you.
Personal question, maybe not related to the Bible, but I'm wondering how your belief of God supports your subject, as a medical professor.
You have my belief in God.
Support your research at the medical school.
Research. That's an interesting question.
Can you rephrase that?
Yes. He's asking how does my belief in God support my research as a professor? Well, you can go back as far as you like, but just historically speaking, it's belief in God that actually makes research possible. If you adopt the view that we are all the results of time and chance, then there is no reason why anybody would actually want to do any research, because it's all just random what happens. So there's a good basis for research as far as we're concerned, because we're formed by God, we're created by God, and we're interested to know what God's about. As one of the famous scientists said, we want to see walk in God's steps after Him. So there's a good rationale for Christians to do research. As far as my own research was concerned, some of it, a lot of it was done because of particular special interests that I developed at one time or another. And so I got involved in kidney transplantation and dialysis at one stage, and I was doing some work on the immune system and whether it's possible to tell by testing the immune system whether a kidney is going to reject. Because up until that stage we didn't know when a kidney might reject. It could reject at any time. But the only way you could tell it was rejecting was when it started to fail. And by that time it was sometimes too late. So I was trying to find out whether God could tell us, I suppose, that there was a way in which we could tell that that kidney was going to reject. So that was one line I was on. I was interested, I got involved, very deeply involved in educational research for quite a few years. And that was because I was concerned about the quality of teaching that was going on in the medical school. And I discovered, having joined the academic ranks, that a lot of people were not actually interested in teaching. They were interested in research. And so the teaching side was suffering, and very few people were doing good research on teaching. And so I got interested in that and tried to do something about that. And I think I did a few things that were important, but there I was really thinking about the students and remembering my own days as a student and the things that I struggled with, trying to come to terms with as a student. And a lot of it was because the teaching we were given was actually not particularly straightforward and teaching. Easy to grasp, so yes, I got interested in that, and then I did on the side. I did some other quite interesting things. For example, at one stage I was very interested in stress, and I used to run stress seminars over at my church, Windsor Baptist Church, and I did a study in which I questioned around about, I forget the exact number now, but around about 80 ministers of the gospel around New Zealand from various denominations about how stress affected them and what were the factors in their ministry and their church that created stress. And then analysed those data and came up with some ideas that might help people, feed back the information and how it might be suitable. And then I was asked by a number of denominations to talk about that. So I did a workshop for the Anglican clergy here in Auckland. I did another one for the Baptists down in Wellington and so on. And they were quite useful because stress in the ministry is something that had been a bit of a no-no. You know, you didn't talk about that. If you're a Christian, you didn't have stress, sort of thing. So that was a desire really to help the ministry. And then in my later years, I got involved in geriatric medicine. I've become really quite interested in issues like euthanasia and elder abuse and those sorts of things. And because I see that there's a big problem around the world with those issues. And so a lot of my reading and research has been in those areas in recent times, and thinking about end-of-life issues and how as Christians we can help other people to manage their end-of-life. So a lot of really interesting things happening. I guess I had a very good friend who was dying, and he was admitted to a private hospital, and I went to see him not a couple of days afterwards, and he was in this room. The walls were white, the carpet was white, there were no pictures, there were no flowers, there was no music, there was no sunlight. It was just awful. And I said to his wife, I wouldn't like to die in a room like that. You know, and that's one of the issues I think that causes people distress at the end of life, when they're sort of put into an environment like that. With very little to support them, nothing that was familiar. You know, not even a rug on his bed or a pillow on his chair that had come from home. You know, it was just all foreign stuff. And that really, I got quite angry about that, and started to think about how can we help people to die better, even if they're not Christians. And so I've done quite a bit of work in that area too. It's interesting. But I guess as I've gone through life, I started off as a young fellow, gung-ho, going to change the world with my immunology, and I gradually ended up as an old fellow who the world has changed to some extent, I guess. And but I must say, it's been an interesting life. Yeah, and I just thank God that I've had the opportunity to do some research.
Thank you very much.
Over the years.
Thank you.
Well, maybe with that personal question, we should call it a day.
Thank you very much, David. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.